Welcome, I'm Ross McKenzie, and I'm very happy that I can teach you this module on apologetics and science in context. And so briefly, I just want to give you an introduction to myself and also to the overall module, and then particularly then Unit 1, the first of four unit. I'd like to say just a little bit about my background. First of all, about how I became a follower of Jesus. And so I grew up in a church-going family. We went to a church that was somewhat like Church of South India, but maybe a bit more formal, ecclesiastical, liturgical. But both my parents were scientists, so there was never any clear picture for me that there was a conflict between science and being a Christian. But like many teenagers, I was more interested in sport and then eventually academics, and I went to university. But it was there that I met some Christians, and I was challenged to read the New Testament for myself and to come to a better understanding of who Jesus was and who I was, and that I was living apart from God and his purposes, but because he loved me, he'd sent Jesus to die and to rise again, and so I could be forgiven, could be reconciled to God, and have a purpose in life to be part of building God's kingdom. And so I decided to follow Jesus. At that time I was studying physics as an undergraduate, and I kept doing that, and then eventually went to the US and did a PhD, which is where I met my wife Robin, and later we had 2 children. And over the years I became more interested in the relationship between science and Christianity. And I'll just say something briefly about being a scientist, that as a physicist, what I see I'm doing is I'm researching the amazing world that God made, and particularly I'm using quantum theory to understand the properties of complex materials. So about 10 years ago, I was invited to a scientific conference in Bangalore, and in that time I made connection with a small Christian group at the Indian Institute of Science, and then later made connection with SciAcs and was asked to help teach a course on apologetics, and particularly the role of science and Christianity. And so since then my wife and I have visited every year. Mostly I was doing scientific research, but also have interacting with students, and that's been a incredible blessing to us. It's given me a much better understanding of the gospel and how it transcends context. But I've been a bit slow to learn and to understand that importance of context. And so the way I teach this course is actually quite different than I would have 10 years ago. And so hopefully you'll see there's lots of examples from India, and that you need to think through how to respond to those. And then also I wrote a blog on theology and science and culture, which you can access here if you want to know more. So just in terms of my background, I live in Brisbane in Australia. Some of you may know it as the home of the Gabba cricket ground, where there's often test matches and in cricket, and I worked for many years at University of Queensland as a professor of physics. And if you wanted to know more about my research, you can go to my blog, Condensed Concepts, and okay, so this is just a sample of the kind of things that I'm interested in. And so it's an amazing thing that you can take one of these jellyfish and you can extract from it a protein. Now these jellyfish are fluorescent, and then the proteins in them look something like this, and they have this small organic molecule which is responsible for the emission of light. And what's amazing is you can do genetic engineering to change these molecules, and so that you can change the color of the protein. And so what this is a picture is of different parts of a mouse brain that have been stimulated in different ways, and that as the stimulus happens to the brain of the mouse, different parts of the brain respond. Now, I'm not so interested in the biology, as fascinating as it is, but the basic quantum physics of why these you have the different colors, and why that there are fluorescent, and how you can turn the fluorescence on and off. And so we use quantum physics, which involves quite mathematical equations like this and pictures like this to understand these kind of properties. So this is a complex material, and we're using quantum theory to understand it. That's enough. And so just to say a little bit about India and Australia, the similarities and differences. And I find these statistics particularly fascinating. So if you look at the land area of India, it's about half that of Australia, but the population is almost like 60 times larger. And so the population density in India is about 100 times that in Australia. And then if we look at the economic wealth, the gross domestic product, and that a few years ago in India was about $1.6 trillion, and in Australia is 1.2 trillion. So then what you see is the relative levels of wealth of two countries are vastly different. And it's quite sad that in spite of this wealth, Australians are still quite greedy, and they still want more money, more power, and don't want to share our resources or opportunities with people from other countries. Now, there is the Human Development Index, and which was proposed by Amartya Sen, a distinguished Indian economist, and you see that Australia is ranked second in the world, whereas India is 135. And this is a measure of not just economic prosperity, but also outcomes such as education and healthcare, longevity. And then when we come to carbon dioxide emissions, you see that Australia is more than 10 times that per person in India. And again, this is a consequence of the affluent lifestyle. We don't have the diversity that you have of, I realize there's hundreds of different languages, but even just you have 21 official languages. And then we have no water rickshaws where you have tens of millions. So these are very different worlds, and so I have to keep this in mind in teaching this course, and so we'll come to more. And so the point is that context really does matter. And when we talk about apologetics, about the intellectual defense of the faith, then we need to realise that's always done in a context, whether it's at the Indian Institute of Science or at Harvard University or in a high school in a next to a slum in Mumbai, or in a Dalit church. So we need to be sensitive to context, and because of that affects what kind of apologetics is appropriate. We also acknowledge that theology is also done in a context. And this is important because worldviews are shaped by context. How people see the world, what they think is important, what they just assume is true, is largely shaped by their context. And particularly, the worldview of a person or a community is really shapes their view about the sciences. And so in this module, we will see that the role of science in apologetics really needs to be sensitive to context. So here's an overview of the whole module. There's 4 units. This first unit will talk about apologetics in context and science in the context of apologetics. And in Unit 2, we'll move to look at historical and philosophical perspectives on theology and the natural sciences. And then in Unit 3, we'll look at theological and scientific perspectives on God's creation, and particularly on the beginning of the universe and the first few chapters of Genesis. And then finally in Unit 4, we'll look at the relationship between theology and human sciences such as psychology and sociology. And so that's the very broad overview unit. I just want to answer the question of what I think apologetics is, so we're clear. And then we'll move to talking about what's the relationship between faith and reason, and what is a worldview, and talk about how in the West people have moved from a traditional worldview to a modern, so-called modern worldview, and then a post-modern worldview, and we might contrast and compare that to different Indian worldviews. And so then we'll move to talking about apologetics in South Asian contexts, and just what might be some of the issues that are important, because both the kind of questions people have and what kind of answers are appropriate or effective can change with the context. And then I want to end by upbeat note of just saying a bit about why I think science is really awesome. It inspires wonder, awe and worship, and so it can be a good a good resource for apologetics. Now, before moving to the first part of the unit, let me leave you with questions. But before that, I want to just say what some of these key ideas are in Unit 1. First, context matters. It influences worldview, and it influences what approaches to apologetics are effective, particularly with regard to the role of science. Secondly, apologetics is really more about people and relationships than it is about information and techniques. And thirdly, that faith and reason go together, that they're not in conflict with one another, and one isn't more important than the other. And we'll see how that plays out in terms of historically, but also today. And then another idea is that science can actually be an aid for apologetics. It's not a threat to the gospel, and if we evaluate it in an appropriate way, we can see how science can aid us in apologetics, in the intellectual defense of the gospel. So now I want to give you something to think about. You might jot down some answers to these questions, because these get to the heart of what apologetics is really about. So first, what are some obstacles to people becoming followers of Jesus? Secondly, what are some reasons that someone may stop following Jesus? You've probably all had friends, family members, people from your church who started out well following Jesus, then at some point they decided they didn't want to do that anymore. And so what are some of the reasons? But here we're talking about our experience, but we want to see about also, what does the Bible say about these questions? What does the Bible say about how some obstacles to people becoming followers of Jesus? So I'm going to end there and look forward to covering some more material. So God bless.